Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar. We are so happy to have you join us today to learn about the impact of occupational musculoskeletal injuries on Alberta worksites. We acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples presently subject to Treaty 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai Piikani and Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today, and those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on, play on, or are visiting. Again, thank you all for taking time away from your busy schedules to join us here today. Just a quick copyright notice and disclaimer. In the event of any discrepancy between the information that's presented today and our Alberta OHS legislation, the legislation is always considered correct. With that, I'm happy to turn this over to our 2 presenters to introduce themselves. So take it away, Deborah and Toby, and thank you.
All right, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Deborah Goodwin. I'm physically based out of Edmonton, but our roles do span across the province. Sitting within the specialized professional services part of OHS, we support inspections and investigations. By background, I have an undergraduate degree in human kinetics with a minor in psychology to get that body and mind connection. And then I did go on to get my Master of Science in ergonomics, and then qualified for my CCPE, which is the Canadian Certified Professional Ergonomist designation. And within GOA, as a specialist, I am also an OHS officer and peace officer. Over to Toby.
Thanks, Deborah. Yes, my name is Toby George. I work in the same unit as Deborah Goodwin at the Specialized Professional Services, OHS, Government of Alberta. I also have a background, my background as a physiotherapist and also having a master's degree in ergonomics. I also have that designation, the CCP designation, that's the Canadian Certified Professional Ergonomist designation. And yes, I'm glad to be here to share this knowledge.
Wonderful, thank you. And we did the math, and between the two of us, we're rolling with about 40 years of combined experience between private healthcare and public sectors as well. So we'll provide an overview of a lot of information today, but we do look forward to your questions, and we've got a fairly good depth and breadth of knowledge that we can tap into. And if you manage to stump us, we're happy to take questions away as well and see what we can do there. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is the prevalence of musculoskeletal injuries, or MSIs, in Alberta. That musculoskeletal injuries is hard to roll off the tongue on a frequent basis, so MSI becomes a little bit more of a comfortable term. So we're going to talk about statistically what is this looking like in our province, and what are some trends that we're seeing in that data. We're going to talk about the legislated requirements here in Alberta for addressing MSIs and trying to mitigate the risks of those on work sites. And we are aiming to provide information that spans all types of work sites in this session today. We will also be going through what the resources are available to you through our OHS resource portal, looking at how do you approach MSIs from a hazard identification and control perspective. And we've got a number of resources available there, and trying to translate how that can apply into your own health and safety program. So hopefully some good takeaways for you from today's session. So the one thing that we know, and this generally applies for good safety as a whole, but today we're going to zero in on that ergonomics perspective, that good ergonomics means good business. We we'll look at in a few slides at how high the claim rates are for MSIs, just how prevalent they are or how common they are in the province. Um, and so you can certainly use that as a business case of just trying to get those MSIs down. But we know that there's other benefits from ergonomics as well by improving efficiency, by reducing extra movements and transfers and efforts involved in doing the job. If the job task is designed better, that work environment is designed in a more efficient way, improving quality because if workers are more physically comfortable, focused, have reduced awkward or difficult parts of the process that they're trying to do. As soon as you smooth that out and make it easier for workers, then your productivity and quality is going to both increase. We also want to look at that broad investment of investing in workers' health and well-being, and that gets you return on investment in the form of better engagement, morale, often lower turnover rates in your staffing. And then, of course, this is there's the carrots and then there's the stick. And so we do have that it is a legislative compliance piece as well. As we'll go through today, there are legal requirements that are must requirements. They're not shoulds. So these are things that need to be done that we'll go through today. So when we look at claim costs, now these numbers are a couple of years old now, so add a bit of inflation to these as we do with many things. So the direct costs for a single musculoskeletal injury claim in Alberta is averaging from $8,000 to $12,000. The range goes from more the 8,000 range that is more your acute injury, so the sort of heave-ho sudden acute injury occurrence. So they happen quickly and the recovery can be a little bit faster from those, generally speaking. Again, these are general, there's exceptions to every rule. And the longer claims, so if you have a repetitive strain injury that has built up over time, that $12,000 claim will start to kick in because the longer it takes for an injury to occur, the longer that recovery often is. And with those claim costs, we're looking at lost time, medical aid, repetitive use, and overexertion. So across the province, we're averaging direct claim costs of about $100 million per year. So it's a huge drain. And so what we want to see is that proactive investment of how can we get this addressed and brought down. And then with the indirect costs, depending on which literature value you look at, often the direct cost will be multiply that by 3 to 10 times to get your indirect costs. So this adds up quite significantly over time. Now, for terminology, I'm not going to read everything on the slide. This slide is intended to just bring forward some of the defined terms that we'll see. So the ergonomics definition, this is the one that we also use in our ERG 045 ergonomics bulletin. So that's sort of one of our foundational bulletins that we have on our OHS resource portal. So this particular definition, ergonomics is the study of interactions between people and their work. Ergonomics aims to reduce hazards by adjusting the design of work to fit the abilities of workers. Because ergonomics is the solution. It is the control for a lot of hazards, especially with relation to musculoskeletal injuries. So while ergonomics is not defined in our OHS Act, Reg, and Code, we do refer to it often, and that's where our professional involvement with the work happens and where the science is coming from for a lot of the publications. The rest of the terms on this slide are included within the Act, Reg, and Code. So musculoskeletal injury is there. Patient handling, if you're in that healthcare sector at all and you're doing safe patient, client, or resident handling, it is a known very high risk activity because when doing patient handling activities, there can be variations that have to be accounted for. So if the person is very nervous or stiff or tight, or if they faint, working around various wounds or lines and stuff like that, it's a bit more of a complex space. So we do have specific legislation that applies to that. We talk about competency. We'll pick that up a little bit later in the slides when we're talking about MSI prevention training. hazards and hazard assessment, which Toby will be speaking to more on his slides. So overall, what are we seeing for the prevalence of MSIs? What are these numbers telling us? So what we are seeing is that MSIs are the most common cause for both lost time and disabling injury claims. So it is a very high amount, as 41% of our WCB claims that we're seeing in Alberta are related to musculoskeletal injuries. This is based off of 2023 data, the Workplace Injury, Illness, and Fatality Statistics, which is available through the open public publications. And we always lag about a year. So 2023 is our most recent data set that we have analysis for. And of those 41% of all injuries that fall under the MSI space, 84% of those are sprains, strains, or tears. So those are our most common types of injuries that we're seeing in those areas. And with this, we'll see variations within different industries, where some are a little bit higher or lower than that 41%. But I would say like it is the majority of the most common type of injury in almost every industry that we look at, whether you're in manufacturing, construction, transportation, healthcare, those MSIs are sitting very, very high, and should really be a regular part of our conversation, not an afterthought to safety, but embedded in part of our safety conversations. When we look in a bit more detail and we're looking at the types of incidents, um, overexertion is the most predominant category for 26% of claims, and overexertion in lifting is accounting for 17% of claims. So we really see from those types of numbers why having mechanical aids and lifting devices and ergonomic lifting techniques and training all come together to make sure that we are addressing those higher risk areas of that overexertion, especially in manual handling type tasks. Um, and with respect to the body parts, our back is one of the more vulnerable areas of our body to injury. And so we do see that the back, especially low back, is the most common area of the body that is injured. And next to that is the shoulder. And when you think of, you know, that those manual handling tasks, and don't just picture lifting and moving boxes from A to B, but also all the use of hand tools, shoveling, pulling cables. All of those are very physical activities that we see. And so those are the high exertion ones. We also see high repetition but low force areas of static postures, from prolonged sitting, driving, awkward postures that we might adopt when we're doing precision work. Those also tend to engage and anchor around our back and shoulder movements. So that's why they're quite high. We do see that male workers are accounting for about 59% of the injuries. And so there is we're still seeing some gender-based differences in our occupational roles related to physical demand. So when we think of Alberta industries that involve material handling and manual labor tasks, we do still have a higher proportion of males to females in those areas. So that explains why those injuries are a little bit more common amongst our male workers, in general terms. All right, over to Toby.
Hey, thanks, Deborah. Okay, so I will be talking more about the legislative requirements and resources as it pertains to ergonomics and the workplace. So as you can see on the screen, we have more of a QR code shown here. Here links to the online OHS resource portal, and it will be displayed at the end of the presentation as well. So you have the publicly available online resources, which also will be shared during the course of this presentation with the following slides. Okay. So, as regards the path to OHS compliance, I think this is always a big deal. How can we be compliant in our respective in the workplace? But as it pertains to MSIs, that's musculoskeletal injuries or musculoskeletal disorders, we this is really a performance-based legislation. It is the outcomes that are the focus here, leaving employers, with options on how to achieve that compliance. So, yeah, compared to, the prescriptive, based legislations. So let's, start with hazard assessments. Um, for the part two, as employers, you will already have formal hazard assessment in place as a foundation, right, to your health and safety programs. But it may be beneficial to review, them to ensure that they capture the range of hazard associated with MSIs and what controls you, have in place. Um, Now, the legislation requires involvement of the Health and Safety Committee or the Health and Safety representative, depending on the size of your organization, and also the affected workers to help identify and determine what ways to control hazards, including musculoskeletal injury hazards. And this is a must by what our legislation stipulates. It's also very important to understand the shoulds as well, which are very nice to have. We'll be looking at involving other stakeholders like the human resource or operations or other others that offer insights to businesses, because they will give great insight on where the problems are. Um, yeah, and so it's also very important to note that to effectively identify MSI hazards and and the affected worker population, we need to identify them, the affected worker population, and they need to be identified and included in the process as well. Because MSI hazard can vary depending on the worker characteristics. So it is important to select workers that represent the diversity in your workforce. Now, based on the general concept of hazard assessments that we have as referenced in part two, section 7, which states that an employer must assess a work site and identify existing potential hazards before work begins in the work site or prior to the construction of a new site. Now, hazard assessment must consider and address hazards that are known to contribute to MSIs now. So not just other forms of hazards, but as it pertains to MSIs, you need to identify what those hazards are within your respective workplace. So, for example, some common physical hazards that contributes to musculoskeletal injuries or musculoskeletal disorders in the workplace would include awkward or sustained postures. We'll look at repetitive task, high impact force, that's forceful exertions, um, contact or impact stress. We'll also you want to also consider vibration as one of your hazards. So these are common ones. Um, Other ones would include temperature and the environmental factors and the likes. Now, so for more information on hazard assessments, we have a lot of resources out there that talks about gives more information on hazard assessment and ergonomics. So you may refer to the QR code that I shared earlier on, or specifically these very ones I put on the slide. So you can use this to provide support for your workers or you being a worker yourself. This will be a very useful tool for you to assess and your hazards, specifically MSIs. And so these are very good resources to use. So, for instance, a 405, the area G 045 explains the MSI hazards, what to look for. There is also very, very good useful tool that gives the hierarchy of controls to eliminate or control hazards. Some of the examples are stated on there. You have work heights, workstation layouts. So it's a very good, resource. It also contains tables that talks about awkward posture examples by body areas. It also has another table that talks about common MSI hazards and samples of ergonomics controls. So it's a very good, very useful MSI hazard identification checklist you can always refer to. Now, talking about the checklist itself, so one of the good things with it is it identifies and controls and MSI hazards. It's a very good bulletin. Um, it helps to assist workplace parties to identify and record as well MSI hazards, and then you are able to brainstorm ideas for ways to control for those hazards. Remember, I talked saying it's more of performance based, more of outcome based. So it's about you being creative in reducing or eliminating. That's really what we want to achieve in eliminating these hazards. So as shown in the header of this tool, so it can be used to record observations of tasks during hazard assessment or can be used in other ways that are meaningful to your workplace. Okay. Now, we have various industries here. I'm not too sure where everyone are from, but irrespective of what industry you work in, there is always an MSI hazard in place. So MSI exists wherever there are workers in all industry types. Okay? Now, so the examples shown on the screen include, the mechanical or repair work, where you have here on the top left quadrant of the slide, where you have awkward posture being assumed. You can see there's some level of overreaching. Then also there'll be a high level of repetitive tasks. Okay, so yes, so we talked about the top left quadrant here that talks about that just refers to a mechanic and repair workshop, and we are able to identify some risk factors here like the awkward posture, okay, and repetitive task, and also eye force for the hand and arm activities. Now, there's a question that came in on computer as well on how to identify hazards there. I think I'll be talking much more about that much more later on. But what we find here on the lower left quadrant here, we'll see that the setup here is around the shared workspace, right? But we have different categories. You have people who work from home remotely, or wherever you find yourself in a hotel, working remotely, or you work from a central office. Uh, they also are predisposed to MSI hazards as well. So it's very important to identify what kind of hazards are they predisposed to. Are we looking at awkward posture? Are we looking at repetitive task of typing, or we're looking at contact stress? I mean, it all needs to be well identified. Okay, so it all needs to be well identified and addressed in your hazard assessments. Also, look at constructions where what is typical with that space is more about handling of loads. One of the hazards you want to identify will be perhaps high impact, high force, but also awkward posture as well is always in the mix with some repetitive tasks, especially when using hand tools. On the lower right quadrant, the picture about the poultry industry. So we know that meat and poultry operations, from the statistics, we have it's the industry group with the highest claim rates currently, and that's because of the high level of repetition and the long duration of work as it affects the upper extremities. When I mean upper extremities, we're looking at the shoulders, hand, wrist, and the arm here. Then also, as regards to power mobile equipment, what we really get in respect to MSI hazards as relates to power mobile equipment will be exposure to whole body vibration, frequent hand harm, and also transmission of the vibration via the feet use as well. So also you could also be looking at things like awkward body posture, like twisting for sight lines, getting on and off the equipment. So it's very important to just identify, what gets peculiar to your industry and record that and make adequate measures to control the hazards. Okay. All right. Now, as it pertains to manual handling hazards, specifically what we have with regards to Part 14, Section 210 of our legislation. So when it comes to manual handling, the OHS code has some additional considerations to include in your hazard assessment as required by Section 7 of the OHS code. Now, these additional conditions are outlined in Part 14 of and that's specifically Section 210 of our legislation. So it's very important to note that there's a further assessment, especially if your job requires some level of manual handling, that you manually lifting, lowering, pushing, pulling, carrying, handling, or transporting a load that we could injure a worker. So we are looking at an additional level of hazard assessment. Yeah. Now, before a worker manually lifts or lowers, pushes, pulls, carries, handles, or transports a load that could injure the worker, the Alberta OHS code requires the employer to perform hazard assessment that considers the musts area, which includes the weight and the shape of the load, the number of times the load will be moved, the manner in which the load will be moved, and so when considering the weight, you want to, have a very good understanding of how heavy the loads are. So because we know that, it gets heavier, the loads, heavier loads would increase the chance of overexertion. You also need to consider the size. Larger loads would increase the likelihood of awkward posture. Also the shape as well. A lack of handle, for instance, it would increase the muscles effort when lifting loads. For the frequency, the more frequent the task is, the more total effort will be required by the body. And as well, the manner in which the load will be moved. You want to understand if you want to say like will the load be moved by hand, for instance, will manual handling equipment be used to lift? Like you need to have those considerations in place. Now the should component, which is like other considerations are not like well stated in the blue book, would include the center of the mass, because it also has a huge role to play on even center of mass or center of mass that may shift during transport can affect how safely a worker can move a load. Also, you want to talk about you want to reference the rest periods. You want to consider you want to give adequate considerations to if there's adequate time for muscles to recover between exertions. Individual factors as well are the role to play, such as experience, stature can impact the risk of activity as well. The location of the load as well, especially as it pertains to carrying. You want to know how high, how low, or how far, a worker must reach to move the load and may contribute to awkward posture. You want to also understand like the distance, like what distance are you going to be moving the load. Okay, surroundings as well also has a real role here, because you want to consider the work area. You want to consider if there's enough clearance, provided for the manual handling task or for manual handling equipment that you want to operate. Now, I mean, it's very important to address the controls as well, especially when you're lifting something very, very heavy. Um, Now, the broad definition of loads, means that this applies across to most industries, like if not all, right? And this includes the healthcare, the veterinarians, as well as manufacturing, restaurant, and so forth, right? So, um, irrespective of which industry you find yourself, once you're lifting any item, that's more like the broad definition we have for loader. Now, there's no specific weight limits because many factors can impact how safe a weight is, and that's a very huge misconception we have about weight limits. Weight limits. So there are a lot of factors that can impact how safe a weight is, and this is just to put it in perspective. Now, one of the good tools we have, embedded in our resources, but that's the ergonomics in the workplace, identifying and controlling manual handling hazard. Um, we have this in place to these brilliant bulletins to contain which contains a lifting assessment tool, and on there, what we can achieve a whole lot. So it's a very quick tool that you can use to assess your lifting task, and it's will give you a very good sense of how safe a task is in terms of your lifting activities. Now, as regards the controls, as stipulated in section 208, so for the equipment, the employer must provide appropriate equipment to move heavy or awkward loads whenever reasonably possible. Employer must ensure that the equipment is used by workers, and the workers in turn must use the equipment provided by the employer. And it's also very important to stress the fact that where it states appropriate equipment is not just about having certain mechanical aids in place. It has to be appropriate for use. Now, for the controls as well, it's also very important to understand, the hierarchy of controls. Um, for instance, like if providing equipment is not reasonably possible for a heavy or awkward manual handling task, then the employer must either adopt the load or, otherwise reduce the amount of manual handling required to move the load. So we've given like five instances here in terms of possibilities. So it's now for us to be creative in, reducing this as practicably possible. So you can either split the load to, make it lesser in terms of lifting, or you decrease the load as well. That would also make us achieve same. Um, or you decrease the size of the box, and you can see that reflect in the lifting tool I stated earlier that I stated in the previous slide. Then also improve handles as well. You want to make sure that there's some level of handles when in the load being lifted, and also in respect of carrying, you probably want to reduce the travel distance from point A to B, depending on what you're trying to relocate within your respective organizations. So the MSI hazards are related to load handling, and it exists in many industries types. as stated earlier on. Then also, as I'm showing on the screen right now, it's interesting to note that we have the healthcare as well, which is also really, really known for handling of people, depending on the nomenclature, what words we use in describing a load, respectfully. So you want to look at the equipment options, like the forklift in the top left corner, where is used uh, to lift. Um, then adapting load as well, use of microfibers mops instead of traditional shrink mops in the lower right corner. So it's just about like examining what items are typically being lifted and finding ways or better solutions in reducing the weights being manipulated. Now, job rotation also is very important. Job rotation, see body mechanics, work height, considerations, especially for jobs that are manually and manual and repetitive. For instance, the lower left quadrant exemplifies the like shows the dishwashing task in the restaurant industry, taking proper breaks and job rotations would really come in handy in such industry. The nursing aides that's whoever handles a patient or a client or a resident, orderlies and patient services in general. Really is the occupation really a group with the most claims when we talk about musculoskeletal injuries.
So when we've talked about our musculoskeletal injuries, as I mentioned earlier, we've got the acute, like they just happen really quick. You have an awkward posture and a heavy load, and you pull or you lift or you twist at the same time, and something goes quite quickly. But then a lot of injuries also are more that the slow burn injuries, so the repetitive strain where it might be lighter forces potentially, but you're doing them many, many times and the tissue's not getting that rest recovery time in between. Um, Either way, if a worker reports MSI symptoms that they believe are related to their work and they report it to the employer has legal obligations under Section 211 of the OHS code, which is to review the work activities not just of the worker reporting the symptoms, but other workers doing the same task. Because if you envision sort of 5 people doing very similar tasks in a work site and one of them reports symptoms, if they go unaddressed or uninvestigated and looking at, okay, is there a root cause that is shared by all 5 people doing this work? There's the opportunity to make corrective measures that are going to have a greater impact on that workforce and protect not just the worker that's reported symptoms, but other workers doing similar tasks. And so that's a requirement for those employers to look beyond just that one worker, look at the related activities, and then to take those corrective measures down at that root cause level to avoid further work-related injuries. So it's quite a powerful piece of legislation to make sure that those, when incidents are reported and investigated, that you are digging to that root cause and doing that homework on there. We also, when we go through the hazard assessment process, which Toby walked us through, of looking what are those MSI hazards for force and posture and static postures, repetition, vibration, looking at all of those risk factors, we put those into a hazard assessment of these tasks have these hazards. We identify controls. We then have to make sure that workers are trained to those. So working out of your hazard assessments really helps to inform the training that you should have in place and need to have in place to prevent musculoskeletal injuries. So any worker that may be exposed to that possibility of MSI has to have some training, and there's some very specific requirements to that training under Section 211.1 of the code, that workers can identify factors that can lead to an MSI, what those early signs and symptoms symptoms of MSIs are and their potential health effects. This helps to inform that early reporting because the earlier we address the issues, the less severe the injury is and the faster that we have recovery and reduce the likelihood of lost time and medical aid. The other piece under this section 211.1 is that you have to have specific preventive measures in place at their work sites. So there are a lot of training resources, and we have some videos actually on our OHS resource portal to teach workers and employers and committee members, etc., about what they need to be thinking about when it comes to MSIs and so on. But off-the-shelf type resources, they're very general. They're going to give you fundamental principles, and that can be absolutely fantastic and a great place to start, especially for our small business owners where, you might not have a specialist in-house to look after all your safety, or, to contract in might be a little bit daunting. So there's a lot of resources that are off-the-shelf resources, including from our portal, you can use to start building your MSI prevention training program. What you need to do, though, is then take it that next step to make it specific to your workplace. So looking at a general video on sort of safe lifting principles that's being demonstrated in a video or e-learning using a box or a sack, that may not translate well for, say, a mechanic that's handling quite variable sizes and shapes of pieces and components of vehicles and pieces of equipment or hand tools. And so you want to take those principles that come from a general foundational program and then say, on the job site for us, this means how we are going to apply it to keep our workers safe. So it's just taking it that little bit further to customize it to your audience, to make it meaningful so that they know how to apply those safer practices in their own work site. With the training, what we're looking to achieve, and this is defined under the OHS Act, is competency. So we want to know that workers haven't just had the training information put in front of them, but they've engaged with it, they understand it, and they can demonstrate back what they've learned. So, and this is where that sort of integration of having possibly e-learning or modules or, safety binders with safe work practices in them and so on, is then taking that information and verifying that they've understood it and can apply it with the physical aspects of their job for MSI prevention. So this might look like on the floor orientation, sort of buddy or partner training. It might be having a training room and doing practical demonstrations with actual equipment that you use at your work site. There's different ways of doing this. And then we highly encourage training records be maintained because it helps you to know who's had the training and who still needs it. And then also from a compliance perspective, when our officers visit your site, it's great evidence for you to demonstrate what training your workers have had, and that they are competent and able to do their jobs and mitigate those MSI risks that exist. We did have one question submitted ahead of time. I'm just going to read it out here because I thought it kind of tied in at this point. Someone inquired if there's any peer-to-peer assessment training where colleagues can feel confidence to help with ergonomic adjustments. And I thought that tied in quite nicely with this piece and around competency. So from our shop at OHS, we don't have any training that we're delivering at this point for that peer-to-peer assessment training. We do have the online resources and some videos and so on to give you some toolkit pieces. As far as peer-to-peer assessment training, so say in-house you want to learn how to kind of do basic level computer ergonomics coaching or wellness troubleshooting, etc., to make sure people are set up in, say, a computer workstation space well. That's a common one that we see. I do know that there are ergonomics consulting companies within the province that do offer training of that variety. I believe also WCB has an ergonomics assessor type of training course as well. I checked their website. It looks like they might have something coming up in early November. I can't speak to the depth and quality of any of these particular programs. We haven't assessed them, but that would be where I would suggest starting to build up some knowledge and ability to take that into your work sites. All right. So that's our session, and I believe Catherine's going to help take us through a couple final poll questions. Hopefully what you've taken away is an understanding that MSI prevention, it is an OHS requirement. It is a legal requirement. It's not a nice to have on top of a safety program. It should be embedded within your safety program. Engaging with this and practicing this really does help strengthen a business, not just from injury mitigation and prevention, but also from productivity and efficiency. And there are lots of resources and tools available to you. And again, here's that QR code that you can take a look at. And I'll let Catherine hop in here to help wrap us up for today.